Thank everybody here for showing up and being part of this. I am actually a longtime Oregonian who is moving back to Oregon. And so it's nice to see familiar faces and to be in the Oregon context again. So I'm going to begin by just talking about the state of the world. Uh, you know, at my organization, the 22nd Century Initiative, we rely on a number of different organizations globally, including the VDEM, or Varieties of Democracy watchdog group based in Sweden, and and a number of other global watchdog groups to help us understand where we are in terms of what's happening around the world. The Democracy report from the VDEM Institute in 2023 basically shows us that democracy is advancing globally. 72% of the global population reside under authoritarian regimes now. And that's as a result of year-over-year increases for the last, 15, 20 years. As of 2023, about 8% of the global population resides in countries that are classified as full democracies. That is according to the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index. And then going back to the VDEM Institute, they report that 43% of the global population resides in countries that are increasingly autocratic or more authoritarian. That marks a 36% increase over the previous year they reported, which was 2022. So, there's a global march toward autocracy. And the United States is part of that, global march. We're increasingly more and more autocratic here. Some of the key things that are, key freedoms that are eroding that they use as indicators are freedom of expression and media, clean elections, judicial independence, freedom of association, and accountability of political leaders. I'm sure many of you understand that context here in the United States. This snapshot from 2023 is likely to get worse by the end of 2025. I mean, I wish I had better news for you, but this is the reality. Under an authoritarian United States government, foreign policy is likely to shift dramatically across the world, especially in vulnerable areas like Palestine and Ukraine, along with other nations that are facing authoritarian challenges and/or severe political instability. This is important for us to keep in mind because these authoritarians, like Donald Trump, are increasingly interconnected across the world. They talk to each other, they strategize, they plan and learn from one another from country to country. And so, it's really important in this context, but remember the multidimensional nature of the set of dynamics that are at play. Each of these countries influencing each other, and within these countries, autocrats learning from the people who are resisting them how to be better at their job. We also need to expand our ability to imagine just how much worse it could get. And I know that that's a hard thing to do, but I think we need to be able to face the reality we're in order to be able to anticipate what might happen here. The United States has relatively strong liberal institutions like our courts compared to many other countries around the world. And so when we look at what's happening globally, there are lessons, right? Places around the world like the Philippines or Thailand, Myanmar, for example, where their institutions are not as strong as ours, anticipate what might happen if there's further erosion of support for our liberal institutions here. And so it allows us to think ahead, to anticipate, and to plan. So, among the things that we need to do, though, in this context, and like I said, it's tough, is to remain hopeful and forward-looking and engage in foresight planning and scenario planning that is grounded in local realities so that we can be ready for the things that might happen as shifts occur here in the United States and particularly in places like Oregon. So, um, also keep in mind that victim narratives should be abandoned as a means of organizing, especially because these are staples of reactionary authoritarian populism. And so they can constitute a bridge. So instead, as I said, adopt foresight planning rooted in long-term projections and really think about these situations that we're in not as a finite game with each election determining an end, but as an infinite game where power can go back and forth. So that's the kind of global context that we have. There is tremendous room for hope, though. We need to be looking ahead, mapping and anticipating possible opportunities and tipping points. For instance, Trump has made the claim that this election may be the last one. If he comes through on that prediction, that may be a tipping point. There are a number of other tipping points that could happen. For example, the attempt to trigger mass deportations, which are probably pretty impractical given the infrastructure that's in place. But any attempt to do so could constitute a tipping point, right? Because when you think about mass deportation, we have to remember that, for example, in the ag sector, 73% of workers are immigrants, right? If workers are forced to stay home or are deported, the ag industry would collapse. Growers would be affected, brokers, truck drivers, grocers, we as consumers would all be affected. Some projections say as much as a 20 or 50% increase in fresh produce prices, for example, at the grocery store. So those kinds of things, will constitute opportunities for us to expand our base and start to look at, what the real consequences are for scapegoating and going after these vulnerable constituencies. So, those things I think are important to just keep in mind and to continue to do as we go along so that we develop our ability to see around corners and to build the kinds of capacities we need ahead of our need to deploy them, right? So now I just want to say that, in this time, you're going to see a lot of street protests. I know of many that are being organized. I think that, oftentimes people want to emulate those protests all over the country, but you really have to pay attention to local conditions. I think we're actually in a time when street protests are maybe less effective than mass non-compliance. So in other words, simply refusing to cooperate, right? The reason for this, especially in rural areas, is because these kinds of protest movements can actually drive further criminalization and repression, right? So that's something to keep in mind and just remember as we think of this. So, if we engage in mass non-compliance, there's reduced risk of violent repression. We can challenge authoritarian policies and leaders indirectly, but in ways that can really baffle their ability to be effective at accomplishing the kinds of goals they do. Less reliance on large and coordinated gatherings and mass protests make us more difficult to surveil us, to infiltrate, to disperse, and to try to divide us. And when we think of mass non-compliance, keep in mind that economic and bureaucratic disruption can have really powerful effects. So, I've done some writing about this in the recent weeks and, want to be really clear that there's a lot that can happen. And one of the examples I've used with people is the people power revolution in the Philippines that ousted Ferdinand Marcos from power way back when, right? When I was still living in Hawaii, and we all participated in the San Miguel boycott against San Miguel beer in support of the Filipino people. But the people power revolution was one in which ordinary people were able to take the streets and to mobilize in a way that protected people who were defecting from major institutions like the military, for example, members of Marcos's cronies group, people who were anticipating that kind of mass resistance might actually affect them economically in particular. People organized to run on the state-owned bank. They, helped to drive activity through the Catholic Church and support Catholic leaders who are opposed to Marcos. They did work slowdowns, boycotts, like the San Miguel boycott, etc. And those things had a really powerful effect. It didn't take long before, after he stole that election and people mobilized in that way, Ronald Reagan actually called up Ferdinand Marcos and told him it's time to get out. And when he did, many of his cronies defected because they saw that that the price to them in terms of their pocketbooks would be too high. And these are just ordinary people, people like us, people like you, people like me. We each of us have a tremendous amount of power if we collectivize it. And so I know this is a scary time, but if we think ahead to these opportunity moments, these tipping point moments, I think that we can get ourselves ready to be able to exercise power in a way that we have not heretofore imagined ourselves being able to do. So, take heart, keep these things in mind, remember where we are. The other real quick thing I'll say, because I think I might be going over my time, is that, it's easy to think that we are incredibly polarized and there's just no hope of people reconciling with one another. But the reality is that the American people on political issues are not actually that polarized. We share many of the concerns over bread and butter issues across party lines. Most of us are concerned about climate change, for example. Most of us are concerned about the rising cost of housing, et cetera, about healthcare, about schools, all of the things, right? Even public schools are popular across party lines. The problem is that, of course, political manipulation on the part of elites has caused us to fall into what people call affective polarization, which is basically just emotional polarization. It's that kind of I hate you, you hate me kind of polarization that drives demonization and othering. And that kind of polarization is what has gotten people so entrenched in the places that we are in, right? But we play a part in those dynamics. And so we can change the role that we're playing, and we may be able to reframe these issues that people share in ways that could actually start to drive greater democratization in the United States, and particularly where you are. And remember that, of course, particularly where you are is among the most important places. You saw what happened in the election, right? The failure of big institutions to invest in building democracy in rural communities is having real consequences, and those consequences will grow worse because the way that demographic change within the United States is working, it's not just growing browner, people are also moving. And so more and more people are moving to large cities, leaving more and more states less populated, more conservative, more likely to reach for conservative leadership and conservative policy. And so the majority of states in the United States are likely to start to move further to the right because of that kind of migration. And so the answer for us in terms of being able to save democracy going into the future is rural organizing.